Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. As always, a quick reminder, if you haven't already subscribed, please feel free to do so. I would greatly appreciate it. And feel free to leave a comment and or suggestion about what you would like to see next. So a couple of things, as you may or may not have noticed, I recently started doing videos outside of Salesforce. As you can see, my most recent one is how to build a website. And as it says there, it's easy with no code required. So that's just one of many things that I'm planning to do in the future, more web development related, maybe some more blockchain stuff. So again, if you're interested, feel free to subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it. Now, before we get into today's topic, which will be more about Apex REST web services, I want to quickly go over one of my previous videos, which was also on Apex REST web services. It was this video right here. And I kind of want to go over an error that I kind of made. It's not too big of a deal, but just something I do want to correct. And as you can see here, I left a comment and I'll pin it as well in case you just want to see read the issue. But if you want to see it in video format, we can go over it right now. So the issue that I had made has to do with the response that I'm returning in our HTTP post. So as you can see here, my return type is set to string. And the mistake I made is of serializing my response. I had completely forgotten that Salesforce, or the Apex, the system itself rather, takes care of serializing the response for us. And the funny thing is, essentially what's occurring here now with the current code that I have is I'm returning a serialized response, but then Apex itself will serialize it again for me. So what we end up having is, if we jump into our Postman right here, and I just do a post to this web service right here. So in effect, what we have is kind of like a double serialization, which ends up giving us this interesting output. I mean, it's still the correct output, the response, but you'll see we have some escape characters in here, which is kind of unnecessary. So let's go ahead and fix that real quick. So instead of creating our payload here and then returning a serialized version of that, I'm simply going to make the response type itself the return type. So instead of returning a string, we're going to return a type, which is supply JSON wrapper dot response. And as you may or may not have remember or seen, this was a response, which is just an instance of this class right here. So by doing that, we can get rid of this right here. And in effect, what's basically going to happen is we created an instance of this class right here, and that's what we're returning back. And we're going to let the system itself deserialize the return type. So by making that simple change right there, if we go back into our Postman and now we do another post request, you'll now see that our JSON is actually more valid, I guess you could say. I mean, it was valid before, but it had that double serialization effect. Now it's pretty clean and straightforward. So just something small. I kind of made a mistake on it, didn't realize it until a few days later. And yeah, so that's the fix. So for today's video, I want to take it one step further and kind of add a GET request to our web service, just kind of to cover I guess like the two most used HTTP verbs, which probably would be get and post. Patch might be pretty useful as well, but I think with these two, it'll kind of cover our bases to get you guys started with any projects you may have going on. So what I'm envisioning, and we're still going to use the same object, a supply object, but what I'm thinking is we'll create a HTTP GET method that will accept a list of names, and names being the supply name right here. And basically for all the names that we receive, we'll just return back any hits that we get, any matches rather that we get in our records, our supply records. So basically what we're saying is if we receive an HTTP GET request and it's a list that contains name 20 steel, it should return, 2 records of steel and 3 records of name 20. And we might even include some of the other fields like total cost, quantity, created date, all that other stuff. And yeah, I think that will kind of neatly wrap up everything we kind of talked over so far. So let's jump into it. In our dev console, I'm going to minimize some of the code that we already written so that it's a bit more compact. But let's go ahead and start with the supply JSON wrapper. And as you can see here in the supply JSON wrapper, I kind of already did some of the footwork. Previously, for our post request, we had created these two classes right here, inner classes. For the get request, I decided to create these two other classes. And as you can see here, my naming convention kind of falls apart a little bit. If this was production code, what I probably would do is I would rename these first two classes I had created to kind of better fit, the post request usage. But anyways, like I've said before, this is just for demonstration purposes and it's not really production grade code. I'm just making these videos to kind of provide an understanding of REST web services. So anyways, these two classes that I've created, this class right here, it's called supplies. And as you can see here, this will fit our need of getting a request that will contain a list of strings, and that will be for the names of the supplies that the requester wants information about. And here for the supplies response, this is what we're going to return back to the request as a response. And here for the supplies response, you can see it's pretty similar to the original response, which again, kind of could have done some refactoring to make it a bit more streamlined, but we're not going to get into that today. So we're still going to have our success and our message, but I'm adding a list of supplies, and the type being of this class right here. And this is what we're going to turn back. So basically, we're going to expect a request that could be a list of names for supplies, and we're going to return that list of supplies with this information. So once we have that, let's go into our supply web service and start working on it. So first things first, let's define the HTTP GET annotation, and then let's create our method itself. So this will be global static, and what we are returning will be the supplies response, this right here. And that comes from the class supply JSON wrapper, and we're returning a supplies response. And we'll call this method get supplies. Okay. And our get supplies method, it's going to look very similar to our create supply in the sense that we're going to be using a lot of the logic and conditional checks, but we won't copy. We'll write it from scratch just to get a better understanding of how that works. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to initialize some of my response variables, such as the success, which is a Boolean, and we'll just start this off as false, as well as the message, which was just string, and we'll just start that off as a empty string. Okay, so once we have those two variables defined, let's go ahead and start parsing out the request that we received. So as usual, I will check to make sure that the REST context is valid. The REST context request is valid. So I will say if it's not null, and if it's not null, then let's go ahead and try to get the request body out by grabbing the REST context .request body, and we'll just convert that to a string. Okay, and just to be a bit more defensive, as usual, we are going to check that that's not empty. So if that's not empty, then we can go ahead and parse that request out and then return something back. So we'll say if the request body is not empty, then we can go ahead and do something. Okay, so if the request body is not empty, so let's go ahead and create a try catch, simply because we're going to be doing some deserializing, and it's always a good idea of having some checks for that, just in case something goes wrong with malformed JSON that we receive from the request. Okay, so let's start to parse out the request itself. So what I'm expecting is to basically get back, or in the request rather, we're going to get a list of names, which is just strings. So let's go ahead and do that. Using the supply JSON wrapper, we're going to use the supplies class, and let's call this supply or supplies payload. And we are going to deserialize. So JSON.deserialize. The thing we're going to deserialize is the request body. And the apex type is going to be this right here, the JSON supply JSON wrapper supplies, and the class definition, like that. And I'll go ahead and capitalize that just to stay with convention, even though Apex isn't case sensitive. So once we have that, what I should probably do is I should probably cast this, the JSON deserialize right here, because it's complaining right here. If you see here in the problems, illegal assignment from object to S supply JSON wrapper supplies, and that's just because it's going from something generic to a specific type. So let's go ahead and cast it to this type of object, like that. Okay, so once we have our request parsed out, let's go ahead and start to retrieve the supplies by the name. And I think I'm going to create a method to hold the logic that will basically do the SQL query for us to get our supply records. And what I'm going to do is up top right here, let's go ahead and create another variable that will end up returning with our supplies response. I'm going to call this list supply JSON wrapper. And it's going to be a supply. And let's call this the supply list. And we'll just start it off with null, just for now. Okay. So right here, after we have parsed out our request and deserialized it, let's go ahead and set it to something. And what we're going to set it to is the return of our method that we'll create in a second. And let's call this get supply records. And this method will have all the logic of our SQL query that retrieves the actual records themselves based off the names that we received in our payload. So let's go ahead and pass in the supplies payload right here. And then after that, let's go ahead and create our actual method. So this method will be a private method since we only want to use it in this class. So it'll be private static. The return type will be of supply JSON wrapper.supply. And we said we were going to call this get supply records because there could be multiple. Okay, let me go ahead and update right here, supply records. And the type we are expecting in is going to be of this type right here. So I will go ahead and copy this and paste it in here. So in this method, let's go ahead and create a list of this type, which is what we're going to return. And I'll call this supply list, all lowercase, not uppercase. And we'll set this to, we'll just initialize it to start off like that. Okay, and then let's also go ahead and return it just so we'll have one less error message. Okay, and then between these right here is where we'll do our logic. So let's go ahead and do a for loop. And instead of creating the SQL query up here and storing it in a list, I'm going to just do an inline SQL query in the for loop as well, just to kind of show that there's a lot of different ways of achieving the same, of doing the same thing. So we're going to iterate through an actual supply record that exists in Salesforce, and I'll just call that supply. And what we're going to iterate through is a list that will be created by our SQL statement. So let's go ahead and select our stuff. So we're going to select the ID, the name, the quantity, the status, the unit cost, and let's throw in the created date. Why not? Created date. We're going to grab that stuff from the supply object, and we want the ones where the name is equal to the name in here, the supplies payload, the dot name. And actually, it shouldn't be name; it should be in. So, and it should be in because we're looking into this list right here. So basically, where the name is in this list of strings. Okay, and actually it should not be semicolon, it should be a bracket. And I forgot to put a square bracket right there. Okay, so basically what this means is we're going to iterate through the results of the SQL query right here. Basically, all of the records that we found that the requester asked for, we're going to iterate through. And the reason we need to iterate through those is because basically I want to build up a list of supply JSON wrapper supply right here, and I want to return them. And basically what I'm doing is I don't want to return, the supply __ C version of this record, because in this imaginary integration that we have with this supposed third party, what they expect to receive back is this information right here. And you'll notice, that they expect to receive name, quantity, status, unit cost. They're not expecting to receive status with, like the __ C that Salesforce would have. They want to receive it like this. So we're basically going to go ahead and convert the data to their liking. And to do so, we'll have this for loop to do so. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create an instance of this class right here. And we will do so by saying supply JSON wrapper supply, and we'll call this the supply record. And that will be equal to, well, basically we're just initializing that. Once we have that, we can then go ahead and create that record, or populate that record rather. So we say the supply name, the supply record's name is going to equal the supply name from the Salesforce record that we're iterating through right here. And then we'll go ahead and just populate all the other ones. There we go. So these are the other ones that we care about. And to just kind of hammer home the point that I was making earlier about our imaginary third-party integration that we have with their external provider, they expect to receive the fields like this: quantity, status, unit cost. They don't want to receive it like this because that would probably mean more work for them on their end in this imaginary scenario. So we're being nice and we are converting this data into the format that they want. Okay, once we have all of that, what we should probably do is we should add this supply record to this supply list right here, which we can do so by doing supply list.add, and we are adding the supply record. Okay, and we are done. So basically, it's going to iterate through all of the records that were found by the name that was supplied in the request. It's going to iterate through all of that, build up this list right here, and then once it's done, we're going to return that supply list. And as we can see here on line 41, we have an error, and the error being illegal conversion from list to supply. Oh, and that's right. We're not returning a single instance of that. We're actually returning a list of those. So let's go ahead and correct that error right here. And kind of just to hammer home this point right here of why it should be a list of supply JSON wrapper supply and not just one instance of it. It's because at the beginning of the video, we said that we should expect to receive, or we could expect to receive, more than one name of a supply. So because we can expect to receive more than one, we could potentially return more than one supply record. So it has to be a list of supplies, not just one of them. So once we have that, let's go back up into our HTTP GET method and let's keep working on that. So once we have the supply list populated in the format that the requester expects, let's go ahead and update some of our response variables up here. So I'm going to have a simple if. So basically, if the supply list right here, if the size of that is greater than 0, meaning it did find at least one supply record that they were looking for, then I'm going to go ahead and update the success message to true. And we'll set the message to something like supplies request processed. That's just something simple. Okay, and that's about it. That's all we need. Now let's go ahead and work on our catch right here. If something went wrong, most likely it went wrong because it tried to deserialize and there was probably a malformed JSON that the request sent to us. Let's go ahead and change the success to false. We'll set the message to something like supplies request not processed. And let's just output the exception error out to the user so they can see hopefully what they did wrong and they can retry the request once they fix that error. So we'll just do get message like that. I'm gonna close it out. And then additionally, like how I said in my previous video with the HTTP post, if you have some type of like error tracking object in your Salesforce, or you could just log that error into your object just to kind of have something to, keep track of as well. So I'll just put that as a to-do in case that's something you want to do in the future. Okay, so once that's all done, let's go out of here, out of this conditional right here. So regardless of whether the request was null or not, we still have to return something. So let's go ahead and start building up our our supply response. So I will create an instance of that supplies response, which exists in the supply JSON wrapper, and that is called supplies response right there. And we'll just give it a name of response. Let's go ahead and instantiate it. So this is supply JSON wrapper supplies response. Okay, so once it's instantiated, let's go ahead and just fill out the information. The success will be equal to the success variable that we defined on line 6. Next, we have the response message. And lastly, and probably the most important thing, is the supplies themselves. So let's go ahead and populate that right here. And before we forget, let's go ahead and just return that response. And like I said at the start of the video, we don't have to serialize this information. We can just return return the object as is, and the system will go ahead and serialize it for us. Okay, so once we have all of that, let's go ahead and save it. And I'll make sure I save the supply JSON wrapper as well. We have no error messages, so let's go ahead and test it out. Back in our Postman, and again, I'm not going to show how to authenticate and get the bearer token so that we can then do the GET request. If you do need help with setting up the authentication to get the bearer token, I have a video that it's included in this playlist, so feel free to follow that. So in my Postman, I've already gone ahead and authenticated my GET request here. So in the body, let's go ahead and send a request over to our GET. So what the GET request is expecting is a JSON with an array called name. So we can define it like that. And then inside of our array of name, let's go ahead and say we want to retrieve all the supply records with the name of, let's say, Cantina band instruments. I'll go ahead and copy that. And in this case, there should be 2 of them. So we'll go ahead and paste that there. And then we'll do a comma to denote that we want to have more elements. And let's go ahead and do steel, which there should be 2 as well. And just for fun, let's go ahead and do a 3rd one. In this case, I'll do light bulbs, which there should only be 1 of those. So light bulbs right there. Okay, let's go ahead and hit send. And as you can see here, and let me go ahead and make Postman a little bit bigger so you can see more of it. And there we go. As you can see, we received back a valid JSON payload as a response. We have an array of supplies, and then we have our success and message of values as well. The success is true, and the message is supplies request processed. And here we can see we have 1 light bulb, because we only have 1 light bulb record, supply record in our org. We have 1 Cantina band instrument, and then 2 right here, because we have 2 in our org, as well as for steel right there. And all the values look correct as well. Okay, so before we wrap things up, let's go ahead and do another request. And this time, let's go ahead and just return an empty array. And let's see what happens. So if we click send with an empty array, we get back a response. Supplies array is empty. The success message is false. Or sorry, the success flag is false and the message is empty. So you know what? Let's go ahead and do a small update to this. Let's go ahead and update this message right here to return something meaningful. So back in our developer console, let's jump into the supply web service. And in here, let's go ahead and add an else branch to it. And basically, we're going to say if we didn't find any records for some reason, doesn't matter what, we're still going to have a success flag of false. And we're going to say the message will be equal to the supplies request was processed successfully. And we'll just say something like no supply records found with the name provided. And that's just to give some more information back to the requester as well. That way they're not wondering if the reason why they received nothing was because of some error on our end or they messed up providing the names. Okay, so let's go ahead and do one more request. Again, still with the name array empty. Let's go ahead and do a send. And then now we see here in our message, it says supplies request processed, no supply records found with the name provided. Okay, so that kind of gives us a bit more information, which might be useful when doing some testing. Okay, so yeah, I think that's about it. At this point, we've now covered how to do an HTTP GET, an HTTP POST, using an Apex class to deserialize and serialize JSON. I hope you guys have found this useful. And again, as always, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, feel free to leave them down in the comments down below and I'll get back to you guys. Okay, so thank you for watching and I'll catch you guys later.